I recognized it immediately. The house. Our house. I didn't remember living there, remembered almost nothing about this town. Why should I? We moved away when I was 4 years old, barely more than a toddler, but I recognized the house. I painted it in the 9th grade, using an old photo pulled from the memories box in my mother's closet. I won an award for it in the school's art contest. That being my first award, I had the painting framed and still have it hung up in my studio space. It was an old Tudor house, a design I always privately enjoyed, though it was long out of fashion. 2 stories with a steeply gabled roof, as is typical of the style. The first floor's exterior was composed of decorative stone, and the second floor was white masonry with crisscrossed half timbers, also typical of the style. I'm the sort of person who is highly susceptible to pareidolia, and always think of the front of a house as its face. This one had a very friendly, welcoming face. If I had to characterize it, the house looked like a smiling, stout, bearded man. The sort of man who would give you a hug upon meeting you and thrust a frosty mug of ale into your hands. That's what I thought. I smiled up at the house and glanced into the messy passenger seat. Camera, sketchbook, loose pages, charcoal stick, and a grimy smudger staining the upholstery. I had already stopped a few times to sketch before meeting with my agent to hash out the finer details of the gig that brought me out here to the countryside. I glanced at my watch. 12:36. I still had time. It was a teleconference anyways. I could do that in the car if I needed to. I stepped out into the warm air of early autumn with my camera around my neck, ready to take pictures if I felt compelled to do so. The first thing I did was walk up to the front door to see if anyone was home. In my experience, people tended to get a little edgy when you stomped around their property uninvited to take pictures or sit down for a charcoal sketch. The front walk was made of the same sort of flagstones as the first floor of the house. The entryway had an archway that I'm sure real estate agents would refer to as charming. The front door was made of dark wood with leaded windows arranged in a diamond pattern, also charming. I knocked 3 times and waited, and waited. No answer. I shrugged and turned back to the car, and that's when I noticed the sign in the yard. The house was for rent by a group called Horndyke Realty. Awful name. On impulse, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the sign. This time, I didn't have to wait. On the first ring, a woman picked up and said, "Horndyke Realty. This is Susan Lakewood. How can I help you find your dream home a reality?" in a sunny and well-rehearsed manner. "Hi, Susan," I answered. "My name is John Benson. I'm calling in regards to the house for rent at 737 Bluebird Avenue. I was wondering if I might arrange a tour of the home at some point." "I'm sure that can be arranged. Give me one moment, hun." I could hear keys clattering on the other end while I waited and wondered just what I was doing. I had only planned to stay through the fall, and I didn't expect anyone to rent a home to me on a 3-month lease. Additionally, it was far more room than I could possibly need. Susan came back on the line and said, "All right, Mr. Benson, if it works for you, I can meet you out there later this afternoon. How does 3:30 sound?" I told her that sounded just fine, left my information with her, and told her I would see her then. I stared back up at the house for a few moments, and it stared back at me with its friendly, bearded face. I turned back to the car. Across the street, a bald man in a tank top was mowing his yard. He waved at me in a mildly suspicious sort of way, and I waved back. His house was also a Tudor. My agent/manager, Lisa Kandinsky, claimed a distant relationship to Wasily Kandinsky, the famed Russian abstract painter. She did not claim an iota of his talent, but perhaps because of this familial connection, she had a great love of the arts. She also had a great love of making money from art, and so with no small amount of cajoling, convinced me to take on this job. Like most pretentious artsy types, I thought commercial art was so far beneath me as to be invisible to the naked eye. She was persistent, and eventually I relented, though not without much grumbling. I teleconferenced with her in the back of the local diner, which had the mystifying name of the Scolded Dog Grill. Most of the patrons sat at the counter, and though many of them gave me the sort of dubious looks all small-town types seemed to give out-of-towners, they left me alone to my Skype and patty melt. Lisa's face appeared on my smartphone screen. Short, smart hairstyle in blazing silver, high cheekbones, elaborate makeup, small pursed lips. As always, she sounded very happy to see me. She always asked me dozens of questions, rapid fire. Eventually, I learned she only wanted an answer to the final query. The rest was just small talk, and she had no time for mutual small talk. "Johnny, how is my boy? How is the countryside? Are the locals treating you well? Blink SOS if they are planning to sacrifice you to their corn god. Is the water drinkable? Do they say y'all out there? Did you receive my email with the packet detailing the wishes of our generous benefactors?" "Yes," I told her, and I looked over it. 12 paintings, at least half of them, including a rustic structure. All watercolor, all bursting with autumn foliage. It should make for a remarkably trite and artistically vacuous calendar. "Don't be snotty, Johnny. It doesn't become you," she scolded. "They are paying an obscene amount of money for your vacuous calendar art, and that's to say nothing of paying all your expenses while you're out gallivanting in the sticks. Speaking of which, have you made living arrangements yet? Don't be stingy. Find a nice place you can work in. No reason to stay at the Bates Motel on their dime." I've looked at a few places, which was only half a lie. The only place I actually looked at was the house. "I'm meeting with a realtor later about a place." "Splendid," she exclaimed. We went on to discuss other tedious details and particulars of the project, while I ate my patty melt. It was pretty good, actually, and probably not made of scalded dog. After a time, she was satisfied that I knew what I was doing, and was not going to waste away my advance on a mad artist's opium binge. I was then released out into the world to kill time until 3:30, where I would meet with the realtor. Susan met with me outside the house and reintroduced herself. She looked more or less exactly as I expected. She was middle-aged, pear-shaped, had a cloud of graying hair, and wore a pink pantsuit that may have once been fashionable in the days of shoulder pads and pantsuits. After educating me about all the exterior features and generally raving about the location, the neighborhood, the schools, and all manner of other attributes about which I cared little, she finally let me into the house. The inside of the house was in pristine shape, although in some way I couldn't quite pinpoint. It did not seem to have been occupied recently. It didn't smell musty. It smelled like cinnamon roll-scented candle. The source of it, this feeling of desertion, was more subtle. It did not seem unwelcoming, however, more the opposite. From the moment I stepped inside, I knew I wanted to stay there and be damned to any notion of practicalities. The second floor had a sunroom with a hardwood floor that I knew would be perfect for painting. While I half listened to Susan's pitch, just enough to answer her stream of questions, I subconsciously sought out some feeling of familiarity, though there was none to be had. Of course there wasn't. Who can remember anything from when they were that young? Well, some people could, perhaps, but I couldn't. The earliest memory I had was in the house in which I spent the rest of my childhood. I was sitting at our kitchen table trying to read a newspaper, though with limited success, as I did not know how to read more than a few words at the time. After a time, when we had already seen all the rooms and Susan was reaching the end of her pitch, she received a phone call. Apologetically, she told me she had to take it, and that I should explore on my own for a few minutes. I took her advice. The house had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the bottom floor and 1 on the top floor. I sat in all of them, spending the most time in the bottom 2, one of which had to be my own room. I felt nothing from any of them. Finally, I returned to the living room and sat on the hearth to wait for Susan's return. It was here that I had the memory. It was a little more than a flash, but clear as day. I held in my hands a drawing, which I presented to someone. It was a teenage girl whose features I recognized in my own reflection. She had to have been a relative. I said to her, "Look, Maddie," and she smiled, taking the drawing from me. That was it. Maybe a 2-second memory of someone I knew then, but have no recollection of now. I was stumped. I knew all of my cousins and all of the girls were my age or younger. None of them were named Maddie or anything similar. She didn't even look like a cousin. She looked like she could have been my sister. If I had a sister. I'm an only child. Shortly thereafter, Susan returned. I explained to her my situation, that I was very interested in renting the house, but only for a short-term lease. Money, however, was no object. To my great surprise, she beamed at me. It seems a family intended to move in after the first of the year, and the call was them, arranging to make a deposit. As long as I was clear by then, she would be happy to rent to me. Deposit plus first and last month's rent paid in advance, of course. Lisa handled the fine details of the rental agreement, including all the check and document signing. I am perfectly capable of doing such things myself, but Lisa insisted, always eager to earn her cut in any way she could find. I usually accommodated her desires, as it freed up a lot of my time to artistic pursuits, such as goofing off and watching Motel Cable. I had to wait until the next day to move into the house. A true multitasker, I sketched and drank beer. As I watched television, though I was able to truly focus on none of these tasks, my mind kept drifting to that transient memory from the fireplace. Who was Maddie? Where did Maddie go? What was Maddie short for? Madison? Madeline? Could have been Maggie, considering how young I was. So maybe Margaret. I glanced down at my drawing. Not work-related, I sometimes dabbled in figure drawing and sequential art. Blame it on a childhood love of superheroes. I flipped the sheet over and started a new sketch, one of Maddie. I could still recall her face somehow. It seemed that having regained the memory, my recall of it was surprisingly vivid. Her chin was sharp like mine, but her cheekbones were rounder. Her eyes were almond-shaped like mine, but darker and glinting like coins at the bottom of a deep well. Her hair was sandy blonde, much lighter than mine, shoulder length and wildly teased. That makes sense. It would have been the early 90s. People still wore their hair pretty big back then. Her smile was an enigma. one that tested my eraser. It was warm, but cold, loving, but not cruel, exactly. That's not the right word, but much like rendering it in pencil, describing her smile in words proved elusive. Elusive. Perhaps that's it. Reasonably satisfied, I set my pencil aside and viewed my sketch in full. I frowned. If the drawing was accurate, she nearly had to be a close relative. The family resemblance was uncanny. I was almost convinced I had been filling in blanks in my memory and made a sketch of myself as a teenage girl. Almost. If I didn't snag on the smile, I would have been convinced the whole thing was a fantasy, some sort of wishful thinking. That smile, though, it meant something. I sipped at my beer, still staring at the sketch, wondering what it all meant. I had no answers, and so I threw the sketch aside. I spent the rest of the night, what little remained of it, sipping at my beer and vegging out to sitcoms. It had been a long day, and soon I could feel my eyelids grow heavy and my chin sink into my chest. I left my fourth beer half empty on the nightstand and switched off the television and bedside lamp. I set an alarm on my phone to ensure I was up and around in time to pick up the keys from Susan at Horndyke Realty. Awful name. I was asleep in moments. That night, I had a dream. I dreamt of Maddie. She led me by the hand through fields of gold, swaying in the warm sun. The sun blazed in the sky an impossibly vibrant blue. She kept looking back at me, smiling, laughing. I laughed too. Come on, she urged, not impatiently, but with the joyous imperative of someone who has something wonderful to show. We're almost there. I glanced down at my feet, still small and not totally sure of myself. Not at these speeds. If I fell, I would stain my pants. They were corduroys and went swish, swish, swish with every stride. My shoes were bright red sneakers with bright white soles. They had a lightning bolt on the side, and that made me run faster. Or so I believed. Almost there, she cried, and seemed to restrain herself from running faster. If she did, she would have had to drag me the rest of the way. Wait until you see. Finally, we burst through the golden fields, and Maddie helped me through an old and crusty wooden fence, taking special care to guide me away from snagging nailheads and other dangers. Beyond the fence was a strip of old trees and shadows. I started to get scared, but I didn't get too scared. Maddie was there. Maddie would look out for me. She smiled down at me and gave my hand another tug. It's right through here, she told me. I smiled to show her how brave I was. Not a baby at all. Birds were in the trees, big ones. They looked down at us, and they were big as houses. But Maddie wasn't scared. No, she was mad at the old birds for staring at us. Go on, get, she cried up at the birds, throwing a stick at one. It didn't hit, but they got the message and flapped away. She laughed again, and I laughed too. Dumb birds, I said. That's right, Maddie said, and my heart soared. We skipped through the rest of the forest, which wasn't much of a forest at all, really. On the other side of the forest was a yard all overgrown with grass, as tall as I was, or taller. I was afraid again, of snakes this time, but still not too afraid because Maddie was there, and if she could scare away the birds, she could scare away the snakes too. There was a path, and she led me through. The bugs went ree-yoo-yoo-ree, on and on. I was looking down at the grass, still kind of worried about the snakes, because they could bite me if Maddie wasn't fast enough. So I didn't see what we came to see until Maddie said, "There it is, kiddo." I looked up and my heart skipped a beat and fell 2 stories. It was the oldest building I ever saw, all rotted out and dark, with one big door and one big window in the top, and it loomed down at me. It looked like the face of an angry monster, all mouth and hungry for little boys. It could swallow up my whole entire class in one gulp if it wanted to. Maddie chucked me on the shoulder, having seen me shaking like a leaf at the sight of it. "Don't be scared, kiddo. It's just an old barn, that's all. But now that you know about it, it's our secret clubhouse. Now come on." She tugged at my hand and I started to follow her. What choice did I have? But no sooner did we reach the big mouth door, but a loud and warbling siren filled the air. It was a bad siren, a stay-away siren, a cell phone alarm telling me it was time to wake up. Even after a shave, a hot shower, a cup of gas station coffee that was as hot as it was mediocre, and a surprisingly good gas station crawler, I could not shake the dream from my mind. Dream? It was a memory. I had no doubt of that, though I also had no evidence to back it up. I could remember nothing further than what was revealed in its contents, and could certainly not recall any crusty old barn clubhouse. As for the identity of Maddie, I could think of only one thing that could help shed light on the mystery. Unfortunately, it was calling my mom to ask her. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my mother, and like a good son, I called her twice a year, whether I needed it or not. It was just that calling her meant having to hear a load of passive, aggressive judgment. See, even when my paintings started to sell and real money began to filter in, thanks in no small part to the efforts of my professional mother, Miss Kandinsky, she still vocally disapproved of my career, or hobby, as she still calls it. She was equally disapproving of my swinging bachelor lifestyle, also as she called it. It seemed she wanted a son who would marry a nice girl, move to the suburbs, get a job as an office drone, and sire half a dozen precious angel grandchildren for her to dote and impose her will upon. I was perfectly happy to be single and also gay. She had yet to refer to my sexuality as a hobby, but I could sense her thinking it. Swallowing my dread, I pulled out my phone and pulled her number up in my contacts. She answered on the third ring, as per usual sounding delighted to hear from me and deeply disappointed in my every decision, my sporadic contact with her in particular. Wading through the mire of conversation with her proved a grueling slog, but eventually I managed to steer the conversation to the matter at hand. I explained to her where I was and what I was doing there. She seemed baffled that anyone would want paintings of some dead trees and some nasty old barns, but was happy that I was keeping myself busy. The usual condescending crap. I tried to remind myself that she was a loving mother who only wanted what was best for her only son. Enough small talk, I decided. I was going to ask my questions and get the hell off of the phone with her. So, I started, trying to ease my way into what felt essentially like an odd question. Turns out the old house was up for rent. I'm gonna stay there while I'm working here. What would you need with a house that big? Mom asked, trying to sound nonchalant, but sounding brittle instead. Why? Place like that is too big for a swinging bachelor like you. Maybe, I allowed, but I don't know. Just like the place. My sponsors are footing the bill anyway, and it's got some great studio space upstairs. I guess, she sniffed, but it kind of seems like you're wasting those poor people's money. Mom, I groaned, dragging my free hand through my hair. I was starting to get a headache. They don't care about a couple of $1,000s for rent. It's chump change. All they care about is getting my paintings on time, and I can do that more reliably when I'm relaxed. Anyways, that's not what I'm calling about. Well, what are you calling about? I have a life too, you know, and a job for that matter. Look, it's just on the spot. I wasn't sure how I wanted to phrase this. The thing is, being back in that house brought back some memories. I doubt that, Mom said, more brittle than ever. You were just a baby when you lived there, barely out of diapers. Well, I remembered something. Did I ever get babysat by a relative? Your grandmother a time or two, she said dismissively. Why? No, not grandma. Someone like a teenager. A cousin maybe? What, like Jeff? I wouldn't trust that little punk to watch my pet rock. Look, I need to get going. I cut her off. No, not Jeff. A girl. Maybe 14? Her name was Maddie. Or maybe Maggie. Something like that. There was a pause on the other end. Gathering her memories, maybe? Oh, I just remembered, she said finally. Maddie. You had an imaginary friend named Maddie for a while. You grew out of it, I guess. Yeah. Listen, I gotta go. It was good talking with you, John. I love you. I love you too. But she already hung up. Maddie, an imaginary friend? Bull. But if she was lying, why would she lie about that? It figures. I go to my mom for answers and wind up more confused than ever. I glanced at my watch and saw that I was already late to meet with Susan, so I abandoned my questions for the time being. I gathered up the empty bottles and the remains of my dinner and threw them in the trash, gathered what little gear I brought into the motel, and hopped into the car. After leaving my keys with the clock, I set off to move into my new old accommodations, vowing to count that phone call as my Christmas call. By early afternoon, I was moving my meager possessions into the house, which thankfully was furnished. The back of my van was loaded with a massive roll of watercolor paper. I worked large, several shipping tubes, a plastic tub loaded with tubes of paint, a box of fresh new paints, mostly autumn colors, 2 suitcases of clothing, a box of paperbacks I hadn't had the time to read yet, a pile of sketchbooks, a motley assortment of brushes, a canvas bag stuffed with other assorted art supplies, and my laptop. I brought exactly no furniture or kitchen supplies. I would take inventory after lugging all of these supplies inside and plan a shopping expedition for later in the day. Utilities, including Wi-Fi, were already set up by Miss Kandinsky, and I made a mental note to thank her later. She thought of everything. I put some music on to make the place seem less empty and tomb-like, and began to set up shop. I had just about set up my studio space the way I liked it, and was admiring the way the sun shone in at this particular part of the afternoon when the doorbell rang. Mildly perplexed to have a visitor so soon after arriving, I journeyed back downstairs to answer. At the door was a uniformed gentleman, accompanied by a dolly loaded with boxes. Handsome, but a bit too young for me, and straight besides, I judged. Anyways, I was here to work, not break hearts. John Benson? He asked. I nodded. I'm with Marvin's Thriftway. I'm here to deliver your groceries. Kandinsky. She really did think of everything. She was a marvel. Thanks, I said. Come on in. I led him to the kitchen, and we made small talk, while he unloaded the groceries into the barren pantry and refrigerator. His name was Wayne, and seemed desperately eager to leave for the big city and start a band. He was impressed by my status as a professional artist. He wanted to see my work, but as I had nothing to show him, all I could do was give him my business card, which had a link to my Flickr account. I left him a generous tip since it wasn't my money, to which he said, "Thanks, fam," and departed. He left a joint on the counter, which I promptly threw into the wastebasket with a laugh. With the shopping portion of my afternoon covered, thanks to the marvelous Miss Kandinsky, she even remembered toilet paper and toothpaste. I was free to scout for potential subjects for my paintings. Though I was more or less ambivalent about landscape and architectural paintings, I loved scouting aesthetically pleasing locations. I grabbed my knapsack, loaded it with all my gear, and dashed out the door. The leaves were beginning to change in earnest, and the sky was as vibrant as it appeared in my dream. Color and beauty were everywhere. I could scarcely narrow my search. The weather was warm and sunny, but with a crisp breeze. It was a perfect day to explore, and I spent hours and took thousands of photos, sketched dozens of scenic vistas, and scouted numerous likely barns and old structures. I was having the time of my life, and I could remember thinking over and over again how lucky I was that someone would pay me to do this. Eventually, the day reached its end, and though the sunset was as gorgeous as any other component of the environment, I almost cursed it for bringing an end to my good time. I judged there to be just enough light left in the day to scout a final barn, the location of which was given to me by a helpful resident. Word of my presence had spread quickly, it seemed, and most seemed happy to assist me in my efforts. By the time I had reached the building, the last of the light was fading out of the sky, and thus I could not take a proper reference photo. But that was all right. I would just have a look and head back for the house. As I looked up at the barn, as beautiful in its decay as any other I had seen that day, I began to feel strangely apprehensive. Though it wasn't the same barn as in my dream, I'm certain of that. I felt the same fear and trepidation I experienced in that so recently recovered memory. The door was open a crack, revealing nothing of the dusty darkness within. Dust. Dark. Now why did that make me feel worse, almost nauseous? I snapped a few cursory photographs of the place, a sort of denial of my ephemeral fears, and quickly departed. It wasn't a long walk back to the car, but I intended to make it before darkness fell entirely. That night, I had another dream. This one was shorter and murkier, but felt no less like a memory to me. I dreamt I was somewhere dark and dusty and hot. Maddie was there, once again. I was frightened, though I was not certain why. I held something in my hand, which reflected what little light there was to reflect. I don't know what it was. Go ahead, she told me. It's okay. I can't, I told her. I was on the edge of tears. I don't know why. Yes, you can, she assured me gently. It's easy. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. It was hot in the dusty darkness, and it smelled. It smelled of dust, and of hot, and of sweat too. It smelled of old canvas bags, and hay, and decay. I felt nauseous, and I had to pee. Can we go? I asked, fidgeting. I didn't want to be in the dusty dark anymore. Sure, she told me brightly. We can go, and I'll buy you an ice cream, but you have to do this first, or else you can't be in the club with me. I wanted to be in the club with her. I loved Maddie, but what she wanted me to do, it scared me. I don't know what she wanted me to do. Okay, I told her, and I swallowed hard. I would do anything for Maddie. I gripped the something I had in my hand, and though I could scarcely see her in the darkness, I could tell she was smiling at me. I loved when Maddie smiled at me. She was holding something too. I couldn't tell what she was holding, but it jerked around in her hands. It groaned. It was alive. I gasped awake in the night, sweating. I could still smell the dust and the heat and the decay. and I had to pee. I spent the next morning chugging coffee and reviewing my photos and sketches from the day before. After waking up from that nightmare, my sleep for the rest of the night could be described as fitful at best. Despite this, I could not hold on to a bad mood. From the aforementioned thousands of photos, I found numerous likely subjects for paintings, including one or two I was eager to start upon immediately. I never claimed to be a professional photographer, though I was competent enough for my own purposes. When I worked from reference, I had a tendency to sort of embellish in the name of artistic license, which I felt made up for my shortcomings in that department, probably due more to the beauty of the day and the perfect timing of my arrival. I had some photos I judged I would hardly have to embellish at all. Easy peasy. According to the clock on the wall and the rumbling in my stomach, it was just about lunchtime. Probably wise I should eat before starting a painting, as I was unlikely to stop for the next several hours. In art school, my workload was so heavy I barely had enough time for my other schoolwork, let alone for eating and sleeping. For days, I would live on Tums, coffee, and cigarettes while working nearly around the clock to meet the deadlines. I was a bit more relaxed after graduating, which is probably for the best since I quit smoking immediately after getting my diploma. For lunch, I had a ham sandwich and a bowl of soup, but I was too eager to get started to really taste it at all. Hell, I was too eager to eat it at the table. I just scarfed it down over the sink and dumped my bowl there when I was finished. For dessert, I had a Tums to counteract all the coffee and dashed up the stairs to my studio space. I used the same paper I used in college, fluid watercolor paper that measured 30x40 and was of a 90 pounds weight. As wet as I tended to work, that was a bit light and had a tendency to warp, but I didn't mind. I liked the way it lifted and held the color. Also, it was a bit cheaper, which was a definite plus for a poor college student. I kept using it mostly out of habit. Clamps helped with the warping. I glanced at the photo reference and decided an underdrawing would not be a bad idea, at least for the barn and the fence. I turned back to my computer and turned on my painting playlist. The Pixies came first, Bone Machine. I nodded and grabbed a pencil while Black Francis began his baffling spoken word intro over a rolling rhythm section and Joey Santiago's wailing guitar riffs. The next few hours ran by in a blur. I could scarcely feel the aching in my back and legs as I stood bent over the table, rendering the scene in strokes of reds, oranges, blues, browns, and greens. Pools of color defined themselves slowly, though inexorably, into shapes, images, light, and darkness. As always, my mind was a blank during the process. It was practically a meditative exercise. Eventually, I had to stop to let the paper dry before setting down another layer, for fear of that loathsome gremlin of watercolor, muddiness. I washed my brush and set it down with the others on a folded paper towel, sipped at my glass of water, and laid down flat on the floor. While I rested my back, I stared at the ceiling and listened to Silversun Pickup sing about a little lover, so polite. For the first time that day, I thought about Maddie, long-lost memories, and strange dreams. What did it all mean? Why was I only remembering these things now? It was all so confusing and strangely frightening. Why? And what happened in the darkness? What was the thing Maddie held? What was the thing I held? Was any of it real? I couldn't help but feel that these were, in fact, real memories. But if so, what happened to Maddie? Why wouldn't my mother talk about her? If I loved her so much, why was I afraid of her too? Nothing made sense. I tried to push her and all these questions out of my mind. I was here to work, not to unfold some mystery. It was a waste of my mental energy, and I wanted to finish this painting tonight if I could. I sat up with some protest from my back muscles mostly ignored and checked the paper. Still wet, of course. I had only been ruminating for a few minutes. With nothing better to do, I decided I would sketch out another painting while I waited. With this in mind, I grabbed my laptop and started rifling through photos again. I guess thoughts of Maddie were still sticking in my metaphorical craw, because the first photo I pulled up was that of the last barn, the one of ephemeral fears. Of course, I had no business inspecting this photo, considering my haste and the lateness of the day resulted in an artistically useless image. It showed the face of the barn and not much else, with its door open a crack and revealing nothing, the hayloft open above. Though yesterday it was the open door that emitted a strangely sinister aura, it was the hayloft that caught my attention this time. It was nothing but a portal of darkness, betraying nothing, and yet I could not help but feel it was a clue somehow to all of this. Why? Staring ever closer, I thought I could detect a slightly darker shape in the portal that piqued my interest. Already feeling that strange nausea again, I opened my photo editing software. Now, photo editing interested me even less than photography in general, so I never mastered the program, but I did know how to do one thing at least. I knew how to change the brightness. I turned it up until the entire image washed out. There was a shape. Now, the program couldn't work miracles. I still couldn't tell what the shape was exactly, but I knew what it could have been. Something I ideally did not want it to be. It looked like the top of someone's head. I swore softly to myself and closed the program, declining its offer to save my changes. It could have been anything, I told myself. Literally anything. Old barns like that were full of old junk. Old equipment rusting in the darkness. Could have been anything. Suddenly, I felt exposed before the cluster of windows that so appealed to me in the light of day. That was stupid, of course. I was on the second floor. And anyways, this wasn't the middle of nowhere. It was the middle of a middle-class neighborhood. I drew the curtains anyway. Who needs open windows after dark? The paper was dry enough, I judged. I turned up the music, raising Modest Mouse's perfect disguise to a dull roar. Why not? This wasn't an apartment, and I wouldn't disturb the neighbors. While I worked on my bucolic autumn landscape, I could push strange memories aside, likewise fears, both ephemeral and otherwise. It was close to midnight when I stood back from my work and judged it to be finished. I also judged myself to be near starving. I didn't have the stamina I had as a starving college student. Back then, I could have set this painting aside, and after a gas station hot dog, or more likely, more coffee, Tums, and cigarettes, I would be good to start on another. Today, I would go downstairs and eat something that had a vegetable in it, and retire to the bedroom. I felt good about the painting, maybe even ready to disavow my earlier grumbles about the project. Maybe landscape art wasn't fine art as I saw it, but if I could communicate something I felt was beautiful, and it would make someone else happy to look at it, that could be enough. For now. I washed my paintbrushes, dumped the grimy water down the sink, and snapped a thumbnail photo of the painting to send to Lisa for approval. She would be happy to see progress so soon. I wasn't thinking about Maddie at all. Well, not much anyway. I had another dream that night. Two, actually. The first dream was another Maddie dream. In the dream, I was in my bedroom, a bedroom I did not remember until now. I was laying in my bed, my first big boy bed, with its superhero bed sheets. Action figures were scattered all over the floor and spilling from my big toy chest. They offered me no comfort. I was crying. Someone knocked on the door, and I stiffened, stifled a sob. It was Maddie. She smiled down at me sympathetically from the doorway. She was wearing a sundress with a floral print. Her hair was wild, as it always was. She was holding something behind her back. "Hey, kiddo," she said. "Can I come in?" I sniffled and nodded. She sat down on the bed beside me and gave me a side hug. I felt better, in spite of myself. We sat there, and she swabbed the tears from my cheek with the hem of her dress. "I'm sorry, Johnny," she told me. She was the only one who called me that, but usually she just called me kiddo. I liked when she called me Johnny. "I guess I thought you were ready for that big kid stuff. It's okay if you're not ready yet." "It is?" I sniffed. "Sure, kiddo." She smiled down at me again. "You have plenty of time for all of that, and I'll be there to teach you. One step at a time, you know?" "Uh-huh," I said. "And don't you worry," she said, leaning in confidingly. "You're still in the club, vice president." "Yeah," I said. My tears were already nearly forgotten. "Hey, I got you something at the store today. Do you want to see?" "Sure," I said. Maddie gave me the best presents, not even for Christmas, usually for no reason, just to see me smile. From behind her back, she produced a shopping bag and revealed my gift. It was a G.I. Joe fighter jet. I had been dreaming of getting one for weeks, ever since seeing the commercial during Saturday morning cartoons. I squealed with delight and planted a kiss on her cheek. She laughed and handed the prize to me. I immediately set to ripping it open, but she stopped me. "Wait a second, Johnny," she said, looking me in the eyes. "There's just one more thing." "What's that?" I asked, ready to agree to anything at that point. "It's about the club," she said cautiously. I nodded. "Well, it's about the big kid stuff, actually. See, I think Mom and Dad would rather you learn about that stuff when you're older, you know?" "I guess so," I replied, unsure. I didn't like the idea of doing something if Mom and Dad didn't want me to. It's just that I don't think they understand how smart you are, how big you've gotten. Mom and Dad, they just think you're still their baby. "I'm not a baby," I protested, with the fervency that only a child fresh out of diapers could produce. "I know you're not." She smiled down at me again. "So here's the thing. I think if we can keep a secret, we can make a big kid out of you in no time. But if Mom and Dad found out, even if you tell one of your friends at school, they'll find out, and you'll get in trouble. And here's the other thing, kiddo." "What?" I asked. "Well, I would get in trouble too, you know. And maybe they wouldn't want us to play together anymore. I don't want that to happen. Do you?" "No," I cried, and I meant it. I loved Maddie. I couldn't stand it if she couldn't play with me anymore. She nodded, satisfied, and said, "Well, that's that then. Clubhouse business is just between clubhouse members. That means you and me only. Okay?" "Okay," I quickly agreed. "Pinky promise?" she asked, presenting her pinky. I linked mine with hers, a sacred vow. "Pinky promise." "Great," she said, smiling big this time. "Now let's play G.I. Joe, huh? I'll be Cobra." That dream faded to obscurity, and the second dream came later. It wasn't a Maddie dream, or at least it didn't seem to be. I was laying in bed in the dark. I could see someone standing at the foot of the bed, but in the darkness I couldn't tell who it was. I couldn't move, and I was terribly afraid of the person, but they didn't do anything, just stood there. The next thing I knew, it was the morning. I awoke feeling unclean from the dreams of the night before, and set upon taking a long hot shower immediately after rising. This agreement, this vow of secrecy Maddie made me take with her, it had ghastly undertones, though the specifics of what we were hiding eluded me. I suppose I had my guesses, but I dared not articulate them. There was something else, she said, something I had assumed all the while, though I dared not articulate this idea either. It was the way Maddie said mom and dad, not your mom and dad in word or tone. As far as I was concerned, that settled it. Maddie was my sister. I wasn't an only child. I had a sister. For the moment, I stopped scrubbing my arm, as I had been doing continuously as these thoughts passed through my mind. My skin was turning a bright, raw red. I dropped the loofah to the tile floor. I had a sister of whom I had no memory until a few days ago. I had a sister I loved very dearly when I was a small child, who took a very special interest in me. I had a sister I haven't seen in decades. I had a sister my mother, and presumably my father, disowned and disavowed. Why? For God's sake, what was going on here? How did I forget about her so completely? These questions swirled in my mind, along with the ones too disturbing to ask, even inside my own head, a vortex of confusion, fear, and shame without a definite source. The hell of it all was this. How could I even be sure these memories were real? Then I thought of it. I could be sure these memories were real, or at least I thought I could. If there was a Madison Benson, or a Madeline Benson, or any damned Benson girl who ever lived in this town, there would be some kind of evidence of it. For the rest of the morning, I was on pins and needles, waiting for the library to open. Unfortunately, I searched online for any evidence of her existence, to no avail. Unsurprisingly, there were numerous Maddie Bensons, Madeline Bensons, Madison Bensons, Margaret Bensons, et al. To choose from, but not one I could concretely link to myself or this town. Frustrating, but not totally unexpected. When I knew Maddie and we lived here, well, it was a different time. The internet had not yet conquered the earth and all its peoples. Fortunately, I wasn't counting on it. I was confident that the library would have what I needed, if it would ever open. I killed time by checking my email. Lisa had, of course, already responded to my email from the night before. She thought my painting was gorgeous, absolutely breathtaking, your best work yet, an absolute triumph, and so on. She actually said, and so on. If there was something about Lisa Kandinsky I truly admired, it was how deliberately transparent she was about flattery, praise, and schmoozing of all kinds. It wasn't that she was insincere. By now, I knew that. She wasn't afraid to tell me when what I showed her was shit. It always helped me to admit this fact to myself, pending approval from our benefactors, which she assured me we would have. I was under instructions to send the painting to her using one of the pre-addressed mailing tubes. That was all well and good, and on some level, I was pleased to hear it, but my mind was elsewhere. I closed my laptop and sought other ways to whittle the time away. Some interminable time later, the time had finally come, and I was out the door. I could not remember ever having been so excited to head to the library, and I laughed at what a nerd I was as I slid my key into the ignition. My neighbor was out in his yard, again bald and tank top clad. I could tell he was wondering what I could possibly have been laughing at to myself in my car, but I didn't much care. Simply put, the library was a dead end. I spent an embarrassing amount of time looking for the microfiche reading room before I realized that the format had been obsolete for decades now. I suppose it was just the sort of thing you saw in movies, and so it was the first thing I thought to do. The newspaper archives were available on computer, and I wasted a few hours poring through them. The only thing I learned of remote interest was that the archive of the local newspaper was woefully incomplete. I quickly noticed large gaps of missing time, probably lost when the archives actually were on microfiche, stolen by vandals perhaps. Who knows? Discouraged, I was close to giving up entirely, and was just sort of walking up and down the rows, feigning interest in the books on the shelves and considering my next move. I thought I could request a copy of her birth certificate if she was a sibling, but I figured I would have to A, give her real name, and B, provide proof of my relation to her. I could do neither. By chance, I stumbled upon an option I had not considered. Yearbooks. The library had decades of them from the local high school. I had no idea libraries even kept yearbooks on file, but evidently they did, right in the reference section. I snatched up every yearbook I thought she could have appeared in and toted them to the nearest empty table. I was reasonably confident that Maddie was somewhere in the vicinity of 14 in my memories, surely older than 12, and definitely not as old as 18. Just to be on the safe side, I grabbed the volumes that assumed her age to be between 10 and 20, a generous range to work with. I was probably about halfway through the volume that assumed her to be 14, scanning photo by photo to find one that resembled my memories of Maddie before I slapped my forehead, audibly enough to catch sidelong glances from other early bird library patrons. Yearbooks had indices. I would have made a truly terrible detective. I flipped to the back of the book and made another frustrating discovery. Half of the index was gone, predictably including the B section. I would have muttered profanity or slammed my fist on the table, but I was already painfully aware of eyes still on me. Another quick check through the book confirmed another suspicion. Several pages were missing. It couldn't have been a coincidence. Maybe a nostalgic vandal would have stolen a page from the yearbook, but who would have stolen pages from the index? It made no sense at all, or at least no sense that I could see. If someone wasn't trying to hide the existence of Maddie, then what were they doing? I checked the previous and following yearbooks. The year following was complete, which came as no real surprise to me. That was the year we moved, of course. Maddie wouldn't have continued to go to school here after we left. The previous yearbook was missing its entire index, and I nearly threw it aside, but by some impulse, I flipped through it. There were no missing pages that I could find, but there was vandalism just the same. On page 76, third row down and 2 to the left, someone had scribbled the photo into oblivion with a magic marker. A jagged black void was all that remained. I stared at this bit of improvised censorship for quite a while, pondering its possible meaning. This could not be a coincidence. It couldn't be. Maddie was not some imaginary friend a single child concocted to fight his loneliness. She was a real person, and for some reason, someone was trying to erase any evidence she ever existed. What happened all those years in the hot, dusty darkness? What happened to Maddie? It was all so frustrating. I could feel the sting of tears in my eyes. After all of this, I was no closer to an answer to any of these questions. The only thing of which I was certain was that someone was hiding something. Leaving the books on the table, I stepped away to clear my head and use the restroom. When I came back, only my bladder felt better, and I decided to give up the search for a while. As I gathered the books together, I noticed something else. The autograph pages were filled out, so these yearbooks were donated by former students. Having already given up hope, I flipped through the autographs, not expecting to find anything of interest. But I did. Among all the wishes for great summers and gratitude for friendships was a message with no signature that seemed markedly less age-faded than the others. I stared at it for what must have been solid minutes while a conflict erupted within my head of impossible acceptance and obstinate denial. Acceptance won. This was a message from Maddie, addressed to me, which was impossible, but true. The message ran as follows. I know we've already been apart for much too long, but be patient. I'll see you soon, kiddo. I threw myself into my work after that. For the next several days, I spent my waking hours painting and planning paintings. On sunny days, I embarked on further scouting expeditions and felt no fear. On all other days, I was cloistered in my studio, laboring until my hands would no longer grip a brush. If I had dreams, I did not remember them. The one positive element of this strange trip was my work. Though I still held no intention of transitioning to a career of landscape art, I felt I was producing here some of the best work of my life. Perhaps it sounds conceited to say so, but I don't care. I was never one for false modesty, any more than I was for undeserved pride. These images I created of pastoral scenes were alive with color and movement, life and death in the season of fluctuation. The rustic ancient structures were not monuments of rural decay. They were structures in the process of reclamation by nature. The emotions generated were of joy, even in sadness. I forgot even to feel lonely in my isolation. I thought I would miss the city, the light and the noise, the constant activity. Not at all. My limited interactions with the world outside my studio were, if anything, an unwanted distraction. The people here were friendly, though aloof. I expected that. They were not hostile, at least. I wasn't treated as an interloper, more of a curiosity. Word quickly spread of my artistic endeavors, as I mentioned before, and almost everyone had questions for me. I quickly ran out of business cards, though I expected them to generate few sales. It was not what I would classify as an art-buying community. On the plus side, I was given numerous leads, and some of them even panned out. Lisa continued to be my sole conduit to the outside world, and of course, we almost exclusively talked shop. She assured me that our benefactors were most pleased with the paintings they received, and were positively bursting with excitement to see what I would send them next. I eventually lost the fear of rejection that normally hid under the surface of my thoughts when these times came. That's probably why it hit me so hard when one of my paintings finally was rejected. I was closing in on my second full week of furious activity when it happened. I was barely eating, sleeping only when exhaustion claimed me, and I'm sure that contributed to the object of their complaint. I was halfway through the first layer of another painting when my laptop chirped an incoming call from Lisa. I grimaced, but only because I resented the interruption. I paused Metric in the middle of Satellite Mind and clicked the icon to accept her call. Lisa's face appeared with almost visible storm clouds hovering over her immaculate silver coiffure. Lisa, how are you? I said, a bit too brightly, as though I were blind to a clearly foul mood. Well, John, she answered, I'm not too great, actually. You see, I just got off the phone with our most generous benefactors, and they tore me a new arsehole over your most recent piece. Would you care to explain to me the changes you made from the proof you sent me? I was dumbfounded and searched my memory for the last painting I sent her. It was another barn painting with autumn leaves swirling in the wind and great old oak trees swaying in the foreground, sort of framing the work. I didn't make any changes after the proof. I almost never did. Lisa, I'm going to have to plead ignorance here. What changes? Plead ignorance? Lisa sneered. I could not recall having ever angered her like this. You're telling me that you do not remember adding that shit to the painting. You're going to sit there and tell me that this was not some infantile prank you played. John, I've been your agent and manager for almost 10 years now, and I think I can differentiate your work from that of some disgruntled postal employee. So don't play dumb with me. Now I was starting to feel my own anger welling up alongside the confusion, and I told her, Lisa, I am not fucking with you. I told you I didn't change that goddamn painting, and I stand by that. I really and truly do not know what you are talking about. I'm a professional artist. I'm not Ashton Kutcher or something. I'm not punking you or anyone. I absolutely did not change that painting. Lisa sighed and said, Okay, John, give me a second. I'll show you the photo they sent me. I sat there in silence while she composed the email, waiting for this strange shoe to drop. Anger subsided quickly, as it often did with me, and confusion reigned once again. In a few moments, I received a notification of her email. There was no message, of course, only an attachment. I opened it. The color drained from my face as I stared at the image on the screen. Displayed there was undeniably my work, undeniably the painting I sent a couple of days ago. Undeniably, the edition was mine. Standing in the middle ground between the trees and the barn were two figures, a boy and a girl, me and Maddie. Maddie seemed to be laughing. I was holding a dead cat, its head caved in. On the ground was the bloodied rock used as the murder weapon. We were both streaked with the animal's blood. John, are you there? Lisa asked, breaking my fugue. I'm not certain how long I was staring at the image. Yeah, Lisa, I'm here, I told her. I'm sorry, I really am. That is definitely my work, but I swear to you, I don't remember adding that thing. It's sick. Lisa sighed again, though this time it was a sympathetic sort of sigh. Her anger was also abating. You've been working too hard, Johnny. Nobody expected you to get all these paintings done in the first month, you know. Yeah, I know, I told her, raking my fingers through my hair. Take a break, all right? You don't look so well, Johnny. You need to get some sleep. Get some real food in you. Maybe find yourself a boy toy, huh? A little fling? I laughed, and it only sounded a little forced. Sure, Liz. Listen, I really am sorry about this. I hope they're not too mad. Ah, forget about it, she said. I'll smooth things over with the benefactors. That's my job. It's what I'm good at, you know? Now, are you going to do what I ask? Yeah, I told her. All except the boy toy part. These country boys. Not my type, you know. I prefer a man with callus-free hands and hair that has never seen a supercuts. Lisa laughed, and I knew things were okay, at least barring any further pranks. All right, Johnny. I'll talk to you soon. I said my goodbye and closed Skype, wishing my own fears were as assuaged as hers. That terrible image, two children reveling in the death of an animal. It wasn't just a gory image, it was another memory. That was the part I found truly revolting. It happened. I did it. I killed that cat. That poor animal. A thought occurred to me, and I dashed to the pile of finished paintings. I had a few completed in the past couple days of furious activity that had not yet been submitted for approval. When I saw what I had done, I tore them all to shreds. All three had been defaced with a memory. The first was of a freshly tilled field, sheltered by a blanket of blazing stars, an image of peace, tranquility, and order. All three were shattered by the inclusion of two somber figures digging a shallow grave. The bludgeoned feline lay asprawl in the dirt at their feet. The second sickened me. It was an image of the kill itself, committed within the barn itself. The original image focused on the motes of dust in the beams of light that filtered through the wooden slats. I could remember the hours I spent rendering this delicate dance, so like a snowstorm captured in microcosm. I could not recall the image of violence rendered in grotesque detail. I could not recall rendering Maddie pinning the cat to the dirt, the complex pattern in its fur highlighted in those same beams of light. I could not recall rendering myself crushing its tiny skull with a rock. But having seen it, I could remember the deed itself. I stared at my hands and knew I was going to vomit. Several minutes were spent bent over the toilet and voiding what little I had in my stomach to expel, followed by dry heaves and miserable sobs. How could I do something like that? How could I do something so awful, so heinous? I would rather die myself than even hurt another living being. So how does that explain the joy, the revelry in my expression? God, finally, morbid curiosity won over my shame and revulsion. I had to see what the final painting revealed. What could else would it reveal? What new horror? I wish I didn't know. It was, for mercy, not another violent image, though that mitigated little of the horror it evoked. The final image, one I initially felt great pride for, portrayed a woodland path winding through tall grasses, waving gently in the breeze. Light played over falling leaves, and the sleeping owl could be seen nesting in the hollow of a tree. It was a genuine miracle that I snapped the picture before waking her. Only moments later, she sprung from her hideaway and swooped away, outraged at my intrusion. Maddie and I were in this painting as well, both of us marching down the path toward an unknown destination. Maddie took the lead, looking back at me with a dazzling smile, arms spread wide and gesturing forward. Her eyes sparkled, and every line of her body spoke of her enthusiasm and palpable anticipation. I did not share her excitement. I looked sick with fear, the same sort of dread I felt now. Mixed with this trepidation, however, was a dark sort of anticipation of my own. I was almost proud of the way I rendered this complex mix of emotion. Behind my back, I held an object that shined like a heliograph in the filtered light. It was a knife. That wasn't all. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that we were not alone. Between us was another child, even younger than myself. His expression was one merely of interest and of vicarious excitement. He didn't know. He had no idea. We were going to kill that child. That night, after finally falling into a fitful sleep, I had a final dream. I was back in the barn again. The hot, dusty darkness. The light was dim, almost non-existent. The sun was going down, and when it finally dipped below the tree line, I would be immersed in total darkness. I was alone. I was soaking wet. I was terrified. Something terrible had happened. I'm not sure what it was, only that I needed to escape. If I could just get out of this barn, I could run home to Mommy and Daddy. They would know what to do. There was no way out. My young mind crackled with the static of uncontrollable panic. The barn was a maze, and I was the experiment, the rat who must solve the maze or die. The walls of the maze were made of the rusting hulk of dead machines and barbed wire. It was Maddie's maze. She showed me the maze. I had traveled through its halls dozens of times, but always with her to lead me. Maddie wasn't with me. Maddie was the monster at the center. Maddie was the Minotaur. She told me that story once, when Maddie was my sister and my friend, before she became the monster. She told me of the bad old king who sealed the monster up where it couldn't escape, and of the brave hero who solved the maze and slew the beast. The hero became the king in the end. Sometimes she told the story differently. Sometimes the Minotaur was the hero, and the hero was the monster. He was an assassin who invaded the labyrinth that was the Minotaur's home and killed it defenseless in its sleep. In this version of the tale, bad old king and his mean old queen were the Minotaur's mommy and daddy. Maddie was always sad when she told it this way. The sun was dipping lower. Darkness was coming. The Minotaur was coming. I could hear it behind me, hear its beastly bellows, hear its cloven hooves kick at the dusty ground. I had to escape the maze before it could catch me, and the maze was its home. It knew the way, over and under, between and through. Bit by bit, I navigated through the terrible twists and turns. More than once, the sharp edges caught me, tore at my clothes, and bit into my flesh. I could not cry out. The Minotaur would hear me. Nothing seemed familiar in the growing darkness. The shapes grew and loomed over me, as if they too were trying to stall my escape. The maze seemed endless, though some small part of me knew that it could not have been so. It was just a dusty old barn full of junk, wasn't it? I was young enough to know that things were different in the darkness. The darkness held a power over little boys. The closet, full of toys, became a haven for the creatures of the night, creatures who would wait for a boy's foot to hang over the edge of the bed and strike. I always suspected these monsters were real no matter what my parents told me, and now I knew. "Johnny, stop!" the Minotaur cried. I could not tell from where. I only knew it was all too close. I didn't answer. I didn't make a sound. I only tried more desperately to escape its snares and pitfalls, ignoring the bite of sharp machines as they snapped at my tender flesh. "Talk to me, Johnny. I don't want you to get hurt. It's okay. Tell me where you are and we'll talk." "Okay, kiddo?" Lies. The monster was trying to trick me. That's all. I was getting away, and it was trying to lure me into its terrible claws. I thought I could see a line of light in the darkness. Was it the door? I scrambled through the darkness, desperately trying to pick out a familiar landmark. Crash! Something fell in the darkness behind me, close enough that I could feel the ground shake with the impact. I couldn't help myself that time. I yelped. The monster heard me. "Johnny, stay right there, okay? Let me explain," the monster called. God, it was close. But so was the line of light. Only that line was disappearing, and fast. Cuts and scratches all over my body sang with pain, and the wetness was growing sticky. Dust clung to me and tickled my throat and sinuses. I had to get out now, or I would be stuck there with the monster forever. I could see a brilliant beam of light shining through the darkness. It wasn't the setting sun. The monster had a flashlight. If the beam fell upon me, I was finished. I groped blindly ahead, feeling the cool bulk of what I thought was the rusty tractor that blocked the doorway and my escape. I knew from my many expeditions in the daylight with Maddie that there were many clever twists and turns between me and freedom, but there was no time. The beam played dangerously close to my position. I would have to crawl underneath. Dropping to the floor, I had to stifle another sneeze from the dust that rose with my impact. Thank God I was small enough to scramble underneath, though I feared this act nearly as much as the dreadful minotaur that pursued me. Many times we startled rats from underneath such machines, foul creatures who hissed and glared at us with beady, soulless eyes, outraged at the intrusion. I had nightmares sometimes about their jagged yellow teeth. "Johnny, don't go," the beast cried, desperation in her voice. "Please, Johnny, we can talk about this." I didn't listen. Under the tractor I went, and never mind the creatures that may object to my presence. She sounded close enough to touch. Almost there. Almost. "There you are," the beast cried, and I could tell by the light that illuminated the decaying undercarriage of the tractor that my escape had been foiled. A hand seized my foot, and I shrieked. Small and now insignificant creatures skittered off in the darkness, squeaking their outrage and offering no pity for my own misfortune. With what little room I had, I struggled mightily against the clutches of the great and terrible Minotaur. I was no hero sent to slay the beast, nor an assassin bent on murdering the pitiful creature as it lay helpless. I was just a kid, just a scared kid whose only friend was his sister. His sister he loved so dearly, his sister he feared. It was over, all over, and then my shoe slipped from my foot. I could not count the number of times Maddie or Mom and Dad would warn me of the dangers of my perpetually untied show, but this time it saved my life. I abandoned the prize to the Minotaur and crawled to the open air. "Johnny, stop!" the Minotaur screamed, but I didn't listen. I burst through the door into the waning light. Before I ran screaming for home, I looked down at myself. The wetness that coated me was browned with dust, but I knew what it was. It was blood. Not my blood, but boy's blood all the same. When I refused to do what Maddie asked, she took the knife and did it herself. She grabbed that screaming boy by the hair and slashed his throat open with a butcher knife. And she laughed and laughed and laughed. She drank that boy's blood and laughed. I ran, screaming into the night. I awoke in a rented bed, screaming to the growing dawn. It was morning again. I sat up and rubbed my face, trying to drive away the memories that invaded my night. No such luck. Just like the others, this memory was here to stay. Maddie was a murderer. 14-year-old burgeoning serial killer. I didn't have all the facts in front of me yet, but as far as I knew, she was grooming me for the same. Her plan failed, thankfully. I still didn't know what happened to her after that night, or why I didn't remember any of this until returning to the town where it all happened. I felt sick. My mind was a jumble of terrible images and unanswerable questions. Eventually, I stumbled down the stairs and into the kitchen to make a pot of coffee I didn't particularly want to drink. My day had to start eventually, and it was something to do. I measured the water, doled out the grounds into the filter, and started the machine. A simple procedure that did little to take my mind off of things. While I waited for the coffee to brew, I sat at the kitchen island, staring off into the middle distance in a sort of daze. What was I supposed to do? Should I report it to the police? How could I explain what I didn't fully understand myself? Should I just leave? That was an attractive option, except the job that brought me here was incomplete, and I didn't handle that sort of failure very well. It was supposed to be a simple, uncomplicated assignment with a generous paycheck at the end. Still, I probably had enough reference photos to finish the job at home. Probably. I wasn't so sure I could stand to look at another barn for the foreseeable future. As the coffee machine gurgled, the cobwebs slowly cleared from my brain, and for the first time, I became aware that something did not seem right in the house. The atmosphere had changed, and for no reason I could quite pinpoint, I began to feel afraid. Not alone. I couldn't say why. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen door that I was in no way prepared to use, I patrolled the ground floor for anything that seemed awry. Both doors were locked, and I could detect no sign of a forced entry. The windows were locked as well, and none of them were broken. Nothing was missing. I saw no muddy footprints or bloody handprints. Nothing sinister at all to report. It was strange. I decided I was just feeling paranoid from a night of bad dreams and returned to the kitchen for my coffee and a bagel. That's when I saw it. There, on the counter, a newspaper. I kept plenty of them around for light reading and to use as drop cloths, but of course, those were all new ones. The newspaper that sat on the counter was yellow with age, practically ancient. I glanced around, grimacing. Someone left it here, but why? Having once again forgotten my coffee, I snatched up the paper and scanned it for the secrets it held. It was a local paper, the Belleville Republican. The date was October 25th, 1992. That was the year I turned 5. We would have moved away by then, but just barely. I didn't have to scan for long to find what I was looking for. It was the banner headline. It read as follows: "The Ghoul of Belleville has been caught." Below this was a photo of several grim policemen holding a filthy and bewildered-looking man out of a farmhouse. I stared at the man for several minutes, but he evoked no memories, fair or foul. A complete stranger. Still, the connection seemed obvious. I read the attached article, Belleville. Last night at 7:14 p.m., police apprehended Eric James Gunderson, a derelict. Gunderson has been named as a suspect in connection with the murder of 3 boys, aged 5 to 8. The town was shaken to its core last Thursday after a thorough search of the town of Belleville and the surrounding countryside resulted in police bloodhounds finally locating the body of the 3 youths. All 3 were buried in shallow graves in the dirt floor of an abandoned barn just off Country Road 3356. Adding to the horror and the tragedy was the news that all 3 bodies showed evidence of having been partially consumed post-mortem. All 3 bodies also showed evidence of torture before finally succumbing to their injuries. The so-called Ghoul of Belleville had apparently lured all 3 children to the site, as the murder weapons themselves seemed to be improvised from readily available farming implements. A vocal public outcry quickly followed by concerned parents and outraged citizens of Belleville and the surrounding townships, demanding police find and apprehend this fiendish murderer before he could kill again. A curfew was hastily instated, and for the past week, the familiar sight of children playing unattended in the streets and forests seemed to be a thing of the past. Thankfully, an anonymous tip led police to an abandoned farmhouse not far from the site of the murders, where transient Gunderson had apparently been squatting for an unknown period of time. Found in his effects was a pair of underwear identified as belonging to one of the slain children. Under questioning, Gunderson denied any prior knowledge of the murders and could not account for his possession of the garment. However, a background check on Gunderson revealed, among many charges of vagrancy and public intoxication, a child abuse charge from 15 years prior. The victim was his own son, now estranged and living with his mother in Tucson, Arizona. The Belleville police have issued the following statement, continued on page 6. I opened the paper to find the rest of the article, but this proved unnecessary. The real message, the one I was meant to find, fell out of the paper and onto the floor. I snatched it from the tile and found it addressed simply to Johnny. I unfolded it and read the message within. Dear Johnny, hey kiddo, it's good to see you again, even if you haven't seen me yet. I've missed you all these years, and I wanted you to know I don't blame you for what happened. Let us start fresh. The Ghoul of Belleville. Pretty cool nickname, huh? I don't have one these days. Nicknames are for the careless, and I move around too much for that. But I've been keeping tabs on my baby brother, and when I found out you were coming back to Belleville, I knew I had to come back too. Do you remember everything yet? I know how tirelessly Mom, Dad, and their shrink have worked to erase me from your memory. Fuck them. I think it's time for a reunion of the old club, don't you? You still haven't been properly initiated yet. And what sort of example is that for a vice president to set? Come on down to the clubhouse whenever you're ready. Oh, and kiddo, don't get any funny ideas about bringing company along. I'd hate for this one to have to die without you. Love, Maddie, your imaginary friend. Haha. I let the note fall to the floor at my feet and sat there for a long time, wondering just what I was supposed to do. I had no doubt someone like Maddie would find a way to make me take the fall for her crimes, even with this note that was essentially a signed confession. Maddie had been all but erased from history, living off the grid for decades. My parents, damn them, helped her along with their revisionist history. She was the proverbial one-armed man. As far as the townspeople knew, I was the only weirdo wandering through the backwoods and spending an awful lot of time in and around Barnes. Any crime she committed would be pinned on me as easily as her first murders were pinned on poor Gunderson. I stepped into her noose without even knowing it. She didn't have to tell me that this one was another child, my initiation, the taking of the poor child's life. If I ignored her note, she would find me and probably hurt other people in the process. If I came with the cops, she would kill the boy and disappear. As far as the cops would know, I was leading them to my own signed confession. I didn't hold any illusions that if I met with her, I could reason with her. Her note made it sound like she had been very busy over the years, and nothing I could say to her could convince her to turn herself in to the authorities. I had to stop her somehow, but for the life of me, I had no idea how I was going to do it. It was the afternoon before I gathered the will to face her. On the kitchen counter, I left Maddie's note, the weathered newspaper, and a note of my own. In it, I explained everything as well as I could in what I considered to be the very likely event of my own demise. I could only hope that it would be enough for the authorities to find and capture her before she could kill again. I came unarmed, without so much as a kitchen knife to protect me. I felt naked without it, but I knew in my heart that the child's odds were better if I came to Maddie without aggression. She had much more experience with deadly weapons in any case. I was hopelessly outmatched. The precise location of our clubhouse still eluded me, but my extensive exploration of the countryside aided me somewhat, along with the clue of the country road given by the newspaper article. With the help of satellite imagery provided by the internet, I was able to narrow the location of the barn down to a few strong candidates. I only hoped I would find the right one before she grew impatient. Even with all of my admittedly lackluster detective work, the search was slow going. The first barn I tried had burned to the ground sometime in the period between the satellite photography and now. Only a few charred timbers remained. I wasted the better part of an hour hiking to the location, and each moment ticked by felt like a moment closer to doom. I ran back to the car and drove to the next location as quickly as I dared. Occasionally, I passed motorists, farmers, and other locals who likely recognized my vehicle. Surely the child was missed by now, and I couldn't afford to attract attention to myself. I glanced at my watch and swore, if I didn't find her soon, I would be forced to face her after dark. The idea of Maddie's growing bloodlust was never far from my mind. How long could a creature like her restrain her murderous impulses, her cannibalistic impulses? I had no idea. I could only hope that whatever she wanted from me was enough to stay her hand. The second barn still stood, but I knew on sight that it was a dead end as well. It sparked no feeling from me, no dreadful recollection. I checked inside to be sure, and found it empty save for a few birds nesting in the rafters. They screeched and fled, leaving behind a gentle snowfall of discarded feathers. More time wasted. Somehow, I knew the third candidate would prove to be my final destination. I knew it as soon as I stepped out of the car and into the woods beyond the road. The path was still there, as Maddie knew I would find it. She tied a rag of cloth around a tree branch all those years ago, and though it was surely rotted away in the span of decades, another had taken its place. The trail was overgrown, but I could still see the ghost of it. The woods seemed impossibly dark in the waning light. I stepped in, flashlight in hand. As I trudged through the undergrowth, flashes of memories came flooding back to me. I remembered the innocent time when I had not an inkling of Maddie's darker side. I remembered my first and greatest friend, the person I idolized, the person who always had time for her baby brother, the person who always showed me kindness, taught me how to read, and encouraged my earliest creative efforts. She was there for me in ways my own parents never matched. I remembered the formation of the club, a place just for us where she promised to teach me all secrets older children knew and adults forbade, all of it given under the pretext of guiding my path to a brilliant future and untold success. I did all she asked, wishing only to see her smile. That strange smile I loved so well. I did as she bade, even when it frightened me. Soon her tutelage began to grow strange and terrible. Though my love for her burned as brightly as ever, I began to fear her as well. I began to fear her lessons and fear what I understood adulthood to represent. When I finally failed her test, I saw a side of her previously unsuspected. I saw her rage. I saw her seize the head of a squalling lamb and snap it with a terrible roar. The next time I obeyed. The cat. The rock. How close did I come, in the end, to becoming just like her? I switched the flashlight on, the light failing enough to make progress difficult through the trees and the brush. I felt eyes on me from all around and told myself this was just paranoia. Every step was an act of will. Somewhere out there in the growing darkness, I could feel the barn, our clubhouse. I could feel its pull. It was close. Finally, I could see the shape of it looming through the thinning forest. High up in the hayloft, I thought I could see a faint glow. This was it. I could not turn back. I didn't dare. Somehow I knew she knew I had arrived. I stepped into the clearing, into the barnyard. The door stood open a crack, inviting. Muscle memory guided me through the twists and turns of decay. I ignored the paths of dead ends and switchbacks, created both by the carelessness of those that left them and the ones created by Maddie herself when she was little more than a child. This time was so much easier than in my last terrible dream. The panic of that night was replaced by a strange calm, and I had my flashlight to guide me away from the teeth and the traps. "Johnny!" a voice called out from the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding, and prickles of fear riding up and down my flesh. It was her. It was Maddie. "I'm so glad you made it. I was starting to worry you wouldn't come. Do you remember everything yet?" "Well, never mind. I'll help you fill in the blanks when you get here. We have plenty of time to talk." I didn't answer. I couldn't. After a time, I forced myself forward again. The flashlight's beam created grotesque shadows from the strange machinery. Ghoulish faces leaped up and lunged at me. Razor claws swiped at my face, and I could almost hear the cruel laughter of these phantasms. I tried to ignore them. The real monster lay ahead. I was close. "I missed you so much, Johnny," she called. I could almost believe her kind tone. A ghost of the love I once felt for her welled up unbidden from somewhere deep within. I still did not dare believe I could get through to her. Not much farther now. It's been so lonely all these years, but I never stopped thinking of you. You're my best friend, Johnny. I want to share everything with you. We still can. I turned another corner. Walls constructed of bales of barbed wire. An image grew in my head of the castle of Sleeping Beauty, and the terrible thorny bramble that sprung up around it. Another of Maddie's stories. I always imagined her as the princess, imprisoned in her own mind as much as the magically fortified castle. The idea that I was her prince gave unpleasant connotations in my grown mind. Through the narrow path in the thorns, I saw the ladder to the hayloft, the entrance to the castle. In this fairy tale, it was the wicked witch waiting above. Beyond the ladder was the rare open patch of dirt floor where sacrifices were made and tiny bodies were buried. I clambered up the ladder to my waiting destiny. Her hand seized my own as I groped at the wooden platform of the hayloft. I gasped and nearly fell to the jagged mess below. Instead, she hauled me up to relatively solid ground. It was nearly a miracle the wood had not rotted away. I still didn't trust it, any more than my present company. I scrambled as far away from her as the limited space would allow. As my thudding heart slowed with excruciating slowness, I became aware that we were alone in the loft. There was no child. Maddie, allowing me my space, nodded sympathetically from the opposite side. An electric lantern glowed dimly beside her, illuminating her makeshift camp. A bedroll and a stash of canned food I recognized as having come from my own pantry. "The kid?" I asked, able to speak at last. Maddie smiled. "It's just you and me, little brother. I'm sorry. I didn't want to deceive you like all the others. I just wanted to make sure we would have this time alone, and I couldn't have the police interrupt us. You understand, don't you?" "What do you want?" I asked. "I told you, kiddo," she replied. I just want to talk about old times. I really wasn't going to hurt you that night, truly. I never wanted to hurt you, and I understood you weren't ready yet. It was just like the lamb, remember? You were scared then, but soon enough, you were ready for that. I was so proud of you when you crushed that cat's skull. I could tell you loved it, the power, but it's nothing compared to a human life. God, I didn't, I cried. I didn't love it. It was sickening. I wish I never did it. I wish I could have forgotten it forever. You loved it, Maddie said emphatically. I think you know that too. I saw your painting, saw the look on your face. You put it there. It was just like that night. It was gorgeous, Johnny. I always knew you had talent. It's a gift from God, and this is the same. It really is. If I just had a little more time with you, I could have taught you to understand that to destroy is just as beautiful, just as joyous as to create. No, I moaned, but something inside me could see the truth in her words. I could remember that terrible, terrible joy, as loathsome as it was, as unspeakable. Some spark of it shone in a space my waking mind had locked away. But I wasn't like her. So what if I felt anticipation well up against the fear when we led that boy to the clubhouse? In the end, I turned away from destruction, denied her teachings. I ran away and embraced creation. I know, kiddo. She smiled. It was too soon. I was careless, like I said. A little restraint would have made all the difference, but your big sister hadn't learned yet to control her urges. That's why I didn't blame you. For telling them everything? I asked. For telling Mom about the animals and the boy, the clubhouse. Mom already knew, Maddie told me. Or at least she suspected. She suspected me, at least. I'm not sure how, exactly. Mothers have a way about them, so I'm given to understand. She knew. Do you understand? She knew, and she looked the other way. Tacit permission, as far as I was concerned. Not that I gave a shit what she or Dad thought. They sure as hell never cared what I did. Not after you were born. I don't blame you for that either. I'm just saying, neither of them would deal with the problem. They were content to ignore it until it grew out of control, or to run away from it, leaving it all alone. What happened after that night? After I told them? I asked. I suddenly remembered standing in a darkened hallway and listening to a screaming fight between the three of them. You came back. Yeah, that's right. I had to tell them I forced you to do all those things. I couldn't let you take the fall. I tried to explain why I did the things I did. I hoped they could understand. They couldn't, or wouldn't. Hell, I guess I hardly understood why I did it either, just that it felt good to do. Like nothing else. Not sex, not drugs, nothing compared. I never even felt alive, or else I felt like nothing else in the world was real. Nothing compared to the feeling I got when I took a life, when I tasted the flesh. God. What did they say? I asked. What did they do? What did they do? She repeated. They screamed, they yelled, they gnashed their teeth and quailed at their own poor fortune. They told me I was sick, that I needed help. They wanted me to stop. I would rather die. To stop is to die. I couldn't. I ran. They didn't try to stop me. They called the police and reported me a runaway. When enough time passed and I didn't come back for them, I was declared dead. They took you away as soon as they could. Surely there would be a record of your death. Though, right? I asked, perplexed. I should have found it online. Oh, that's easy. There probably is a record somewhere, no matter how hard I tried to cover my tracks and no matter how much our parents tried to hide the truth. That's why they changed their name. Yours too. Of course, I muttered. It was so simple. I should have thought of it. The rest, she told me, as far as I know, is simple programming. You were so young, so pliable. I don't know the particulars of it, of course, but they got some shrink to fill your head with bullshit and fucking gaslighted you into thinking I never existed, and that all of those times we had together were nothing but nightmares and daydreams. They really did a number on you, little brother. God, I wish I had killed them too. I still could. I know where they are. I was dumbstruck, but it all made sense. Even as recently as a few weeks ago, my mother was still up to those tricks, still turning a blind eye. I could hate her for that, but I still didn't want her to die. Maddie, maybe Mom and Dad were not the best parents, but you can't kill them. Please, please, you've got to stop. You have no right. Maddie just stared back at me, eyes cold and mouth set. My stomach dropped a few floors and my brain pulsed with static, the onset of panic. I knew that look from years ago, from the first test. The lamb. Rage was coming. No right, she bellowed, the tendons in her neck standing in stark relief. For the first time, I noticed the ripple of muscle beneath her skin, like a mixed martial arts fighter. She must have spent years training her body into a machine every bit as powerful and awesome as the hulks that rusted below us. She advanced on me, and I tried to shrink back into the wall. I suddenly wish I had brought a gun. No right! Who decides what is right, brother? Was it right for those bastards to turn their back on me, to take you away and fill your head with lies? I'm the only one who ever told you the truth, and you take their side? She roared and leapt at me. Somehow I rolled away in time. The ancient boards creaked menacingly with her impact. The window gaped open at my back. A short wall, the only thing separating me from hanging out into the open air. Stop. Maddie, please. I begged. Stop. Let's talk about this. Too late, kiddo, she said, stalking toward me. Again I tried to scramble away, but there was nowhere to go. I wanted to talk, but you turned on me, just like the others, you son of a bitch. In a fluid motion, she leapt at me again, drawing a knife from a sheath at her hip. I wasn't fast enough this time. The blade drew blood from my left arm, searing pain. The bloodied knife shone blackly in the moonlight. The impact shook the rotted boards again, and they felt terribly close to collapse. I sprung away, but she was ready. I begged her again and again to stop, but the sight of my blood only intensified her fury. She swiped the blade back and forth as I backpedaled and sidestepped desperately, and with limited success. I was bleeding now from several wounds in my chest and arms. Some were shallow, some felt horribly deep. I was going to die. Finally, sick of a cat and mouse game, Maddie charged at me and tackled me to the ground. She rose the gory knife high to deliver a killing blow when the floorboards finally gave way. It felt like we fell forever. I fell badly on my arm and felt it snap, and I screamed with a pain never before suspected. Somewhere through this agonized haze, I could hear Maddie scream as well. I looked and saw her bleeding from wounds of her own. Nails and shards of wood pierced her side where she landed. No mortal wounds, but as a gestalt, it was more than enough to keep her busy for a minute. I gritted my teeth and prepared to move, to escape. I half crawled, half lurched toward the bramble forest, bleeding in 1,000 places. I held my shattered arm with the one still whole and focused all my energy on not blacking out. One step, another. another. A hand seized my foot, and a banshee shrieked from somewhere behind me. I fell to the ground, trying and failing to protect my arm. Blackness crowded around my vision. I was going to die. "Nuh-uh, kiddo. We're not done here yet," the Minotaur snarled. Her eyes shone in the failing light of the lantern, which landed somewhere nearby. Something else shone. I wasn't sure what. The blackness was crowding in too deep. It was close. I reached. She crawled up my prone body. My arm sang a spirited symphony of outrage. The Wicked Witch was on top of me, straddled my sides. She stared into my eyes, but I saw no life there, only death. She bared her teeth at me. They seemed terribly sharp. My neck was terribly exposed. My hand found the shining thing it sought. I swung the shining thing at Maddie with all of my remaining strength. There was more of it than I thought. The Maddie thing shrieked again and clawed at its neck. Something had sprouted there, protruding from the base where neck met shoulder. She rolled off of me, still screaming. In the dim light, I could see the shining thing was her knife. Somehow, I found the strength to rise and crawl to her. Her screams had stopped by the time I reached her. I looked down at my sister, her face growing peaceful. Rage had subsided at last. She looked up at me and smiled, tears welling in her eyes. I loved it when she smiled at me. Somehow, I forgot about the pain, forgot about dying. I wanted to tell her something, but I didn't know what it was. She had something to tell me too, and she did know what it was. She said, "Oh, kiddo, am I your first?" Then Maddie died. I don't remember much about the rest of that night. I somehow managed to call 911, and I somehow managed to direct them to that remote barn. Maybe they tracked my cell phone, I don't know. All I can say for certain is that I eventually woke up in a hospital. The police had the predictable onslaught of questions for me, though they were kind enough to wait until I was lucid enough to answer them. I answered their questions as honestly as possible, including admitting that I killed my sister. They seemed to accept my self-defense plea, though I suppose I won't know for certain until it goes to trial. I heard from Lisa before I heard from Mom or Dad. She called me in the hospital with her own onslaught of questions. Thankfully, as per usual, she did not require answers to most of them. After determining that I was going to survive my injuries, it was back to business for her. She assured me that she would handle the benefactors. However, I decided to move forward with the project. Mom and Dad did eventually call, but I couldn't answer either of them. I wasn't ready for the conversation we had coming. When I finally had time to think about all that had happened, the story that began when I was just 4 years old, I was at a loss for how to feel. She was a monster, a psychopath, a murderer, and a cannibal. She tried to make me like herself. She was my sister. I loved her. I wanted to be just like her. I don't know what the future holds for me, but my past is clearer than it's ever been. I remember everything. I remember Maddie